Everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So, this is the last book in the Sorcery and Cecilia trilogy, Patricia C. Wrede, Caroline Stevermer, and uh, it's called Or 10 Years After, and I believe, although I could be wrong, that this was actually written 10 years after the end of the last book. It could also just be that at the end of Grand Tour, when Kate is talking to Thomas and says to him that she's imagining what they'll be like 10 years from now, that this could just be a direct and specific reference to that. I couldn't tell you for sure. So, this weird trucky thing on the front is actually an early steam engine because, of course, this book is set around the time that steam engines were first being invented, the time that trains were first being invented. In point of fact, partway through this book, James and Cecy go on a ride on a train, and James talks about how the whole thing was distinctly unsettling because you couldn't speak to the driver, and how it went tremendously fast. It went at a whole 20 miles per hour, which, I mean, given that one would be used at that point in time to be traveling with horses pulling you, and of course, horses being animals can only go so fast for so long, and they have some very strict limitations. Um, it would seem incredibly fast. But what's interesting about this is we've returned to the epistolary form that marked Sorcery and Cecilia, because if you'll recall in the Grand Tour, it was Kate's diary, her commonplace book, and a deposition by Cecy to various officials about what had happened while they were on their wedding journey. Well, this returns to letters, but what's very interesting in this is that for the first time we hear James and Thomas in their own words. Um, Now, how their own words pan out isn't particularly surprising, given that, of course, we've been hearing the dialogue from them through Kate and Cecy throughout the last two books. But it's nonetheless nice to have that little broadening. So this whole book is told through a series of letters exchanged between Kate and Cecy and James and Thomas. And this is another uh, series of actions, as in the first book, where two connected series of events are happening in two places. However, this time, unlike in the first book, where the two of them were having two separate, albeit connected but nonetheless fundamentally separate adventures, in this, their respective back and forths are actually all directly connected to each other. It's all clearly one big thing. Kate's is a great deal less exciting, I think, than Cecy's in terms of what happened, because Kate and Thomas stay at home, and James and Cecy, who have been commissioned by the now Prime Minister, Lord Wellington, Duke Wellington, His Grace, to look into a missing magician surveyor who is from Prussia or Germany. I don't recall offhand. That would require me to take notes and prepare. And we all know we all know that I don't do that. In any event, so this particular book, um, in this book, the surveyor goes missing, so James and Cecy basically get asked, well, gets asked, and Cecy isn't going to not go with him, to head up into the north end of the country, the Yorkshire region, somewhere fairly close to Leeds. Um, and they get asked to look into what happened and why he went missing and where he went missing to. And they leave their children with Kate and Thomas. So Kate and Thomas have to deal with the misadventures of having several children in the house, the eldest of whom are very determined to do exciting and adventurous things, especially Kate and Thomas's son Edward, who decides to climb into a tinker slash gypsy's wagon and gets carted off in it. Along with during which adventure he winds up being uh, stuck in a house with a girl named who goes only by the name of Drina. And so Kate and Thomas basically get involved in trying to figure out who this person was that kidnapped Edward and who Drina is because she is dressed in exceedingly expensive clothing. And so she must have well off parents who are missing her. And so they're basically just trying to figure out who her parents are and return her to them, and to figure out who's trying to break into their property. And, but in the meanwhile, Cecy and James are dealing with the Webb siblings who are trying to get them to invest and who are living in a tower that was made out of a stone circle that is one of the many stone circles to be found all over the British Isles, which are like Stonehenge. Like there are a lot of mini Stonehenges all over, and like all over the country in reality. Some of them are nothing more than slightly upraised circles of ground with some lumps that various archaeologists inform us used to be wooden posts. But there are other stone circles that still have very large lumps of rock in a circle. Um, and I'm not going to go into the archaeology of that because, frankly, I have never had a particularly deep interest in henges, and I usually stick with their combined religious and calendar based purposes as being my go to understanding of what they are. And after that, I'm really not all that interested, despite the evidence that they somehow managed to haul rocks from goodness knows how far away off over half the country to make these things. Um, in any event, so James and Cecy have to deal with this. They have to deal with figuring out what's going on with these brand new railway companies, which are just getting established. They're like Regency period startup companies, because a rail engine is a just a brand new technology. This is something nobody's ever done before. Nobody's ever made companies hauling coal with them before. So the whole thing is exceedingly exciting and new. Um, so in the course of events, we do find out that the people who were trying to break into Thomas and Kate's home were connected with the Webbs, but in point of fact, there were two simultaneous plots going on because this one man, Medway, he was a servant for a cousin of the Webb siblings previously mentioned, and that Webb cousin had gone to Oxford. Well, Medway wanted to go to university, and so he listened at keyholes, but when his master took ill and then died, he just stepped into the man's role because the young Master Webb had been so much more interested in drinking and keeping to himself that nobody actually knew what he looked like, and so Medway was able to just pretend to be him. The only problem was that the Webb cousins, the Webb siblings, found out that their cousin had died, and that they found out that their cousin had died, and if the screen goes black, that's me having not paid attention to the fact that I shouldn't leave things sitting there. And so they came out and they blackmailed Medway. Unfortunately, somebody else had also figured out that Medway had taken the place of the Webb cousin, and that person also wound up blackmailing Medway. In the end, I feel mild sympathy for him because while he does kidnap one of the heirs apparent to the throne, which is Drina, who turns out to be the Princess Alexandrina Victoria, and he does help the Webbs with their attempts to use the magic of ley lines and various stone circles to attempt to influence Parliament, because apparently there is a complex spell going back literally thousands of years connecting together all of the ley lines and stones and so on. While he does get involved in both of these, one gets the feeling that part of the reason he got involved was because he was being blackmailed. And so he is kind of a villain for the various things that he does, but at the same time, it does leave one wondering just a little bit what he would have done if he had been allowed to just finish his studies at Oxford and go on to do whatever he might have been considering doing. In any event, at the end of this, we get, of course, the quite exciting denouement that somehow people get it into their heads that Thomas was the one who kidnapped Drina, and so the Duchess, who is Drina's mother, shows up with half the army in tow to accuse Thomas of being of high treason, which of course baffles everyone because he has done nothing. And there is a wonderful final delightful ending for Kate and James, where Aunt Charlotte manages to track them down out in the country. Well, she doesn't track them down. There's a whole subplot about Georgie. You remember Georgie from the first book? Kate's sister. Kate's sister had gotten married to a duke and then showed up at Kate's having under the impression that her husband was trying to kill her because Georgie is a lunatic and not very bright. And somehow Aunt Charlotte had managed to track Georgie's husband down to the North Country, and James winds up writing rather sharply, or not sharply, sarcastically, somewhat sarcastically to Thomas, that if it weren't for the fact that he would have to deal with her, because he was genuinely impressed at her ability to track the man down, that he said if he wouldn't have to deal with her, he would absolutely recommend her to Wellington to work for the various investigation offices because her skill at tracking Daniel down was so very impressive. And she shows up and absolutely flips out at the Webbs and causes the Webbs to basically lose it and try to pull off a spell to transform possibly everyone there into dogs. There's a spell that's transforming people into dogs floating around in this. And there's a kerfuffle, and both Webbs wind up being turned into dogs instead. But Aunt Charlotte plays her very dramatic role in this, and anyways, this is a very funny book. It's amusing. It's very much in line with the others, and if you liked the first two, I highly recommend it. And I think that's everything, so I will see you all next week.